The industry has created, sometimes voluntarily, sometimes with the encouragement of the states, programs to address addicted gambling. But it's usually extremely low considering what the problems are. And when you add up the benefits and you do a valid cost-benefit analysis, the costs simply overwhelm the benefits. And I put up 2 or 3 overheads in this hearing to demonstrate that. It's really a slam dunk when it comes. This is not a debatable issue. I mean, there's no debate on this. The costs are just really very large. It's like drug addiction. They call it the crack cocaine of creating addiction, is this gambling addiction. So that's not my terminology. That's the overwhelming terminology of the majority of sociologists and psychologists who deal with the area. So it's a very large social problem. I remember Jesse Jackson Jr. coming to Chicago on Martin Luther King Day and saying this is and this is a very contentious statement, but he said these are the new economic chains on our people.
Well, my time is going. Let me conclude, Mr. Chairman, if you just indulge me an additional minute. I ask unanimous consent. I cannot pose a question to Mr. Vallandam, but let me say this. Even without this legislation, I think what you are suggesting that this legislation would go to the expansion of what may be a vastly costly disease, which is gambling, period. My concern would be, are we finding a solution to the cancer? Are we narrowing it to one isolated form of gambling, or when we can bring the industry in and challenge it to do a better job, period? If we don't have internet gambling, or if we have these carve-outs, we have a fractured bill, then we're still not getting to the sickness of gambling for those who are sick in doing it. And so I make that point, and I make the point that the bill seems to, and as I said, the proponent is not in the room, and I'm sorry that he is not, but hopefully we'll have some further explanation. I think we went through this before, Mr. Carville, and to Mr. Scott. We went through this before. But I conclude by saying this, that the issue of this gambling issue, Mr. Chairman and Mr. Ranking Member, needs to be broader than the immediate hearing that we have. And I'm going to put 2 questions on the record, so I'm going to end, and they can give it to me in writing. And then I will pose the question because I was taken aback by a hearing by the Energy and Commerce Committee on criminal activity with children and internet sexual activities. Again, I'm just making a brief comment, and I would commend to the chairman and the ranking member, since they were talking about criminal penalties in the Energy and Commerce Committee, that we might have a subsequent hearing dealing with the utilization of the internet for abuse against children. Let me read these 2 questions. Does the administration support total ban, or does it wish to permit the interpretation of horse racing, looks like interpretation of horse racing to be a subject to controversy? If the exception were deleted from H.R. 777, would the domestic horse racing industry stop this practice? In any event, we'll have these in writings, and I thank the chairman and the ranking member for the indulgence.
I thank the gentlelady. Now, folks, we're on a stopwatch to try to beat that floor vote, so I think we're going to have a second round. Mr. Kent, you indicated you might want to make a statement during Mr. Conyers' questioning. Did you get a chance to do that?
No, sir. I'm fine, and I know that I was perhaps going out of order, and I apologize to Mr. Scott as a fellow Virginian in my former life when I addressed one of my comments to Representative Lee.
Okay, I wanted to be sure that you were heard.
Let me just say that in response to Ms. Lee's question, that from my limited knowledge of reading through the bill, and my interpretation would be I do not believe that it either enables or overturns the horse racing. Now again, the bill changes rapidly, but that is my interpretation at this point. And the only other point I would make with regard to Mr. Cannon, and I hope I'm not speaking out of order again, is that I think this debate in the legislative hearing would be introduced into any court proceeding. So Mr. Goodlatz and the intent of Congress would, in fact, be determinative, I would hope, if the court was having trouble deciding how to interpret the particular statute.
All right, thank you, Mr. Kent. Mr. Banker, I pronounce banker a whole lot more precise than I do Mr. Vallingham. Mr. Vallingham, you testified that as it pertains to banks, H.R. 4777 would create a quote, added burden of monitoring all payment transactions for the taint of internet gambling. What section of 4777 are you stating that would create that burden?
Well, as I understand it, Mr. Chairman, it would criminalize anybody who was involved in the process of transferring those payments, including the banks, knowingly or unknowingly. So ultimately, we would be responsible for the monitor of those payments and the prohibition of those payments.
Well, is it true, sir, that the banking industry is already taking steps to assist in the identification of money laundering, one of the serious concerns related to internet gambling?
Yes, sir. The Anti-Money Laundering Act is something that we are vigorously pursuing, and in doing so, we identify those customers which we deal with, and we also monitor transactions of a certain threshold and report those, but we're not responsible for making any decisions about whether they're legal or illegal. We're only responsible for the reporting of those transactions, in which another entity makes the determination whether those are viable transactions or not.
Thank you, sir. And Professor Kent, I apologize for having demoted you to the School of Law. I didn't realize that it was an innocent omission on my part. I have exhausted my time. I'll yield to the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Kine, you mentioned the question of whether the taxes could offset the social costs. If you've got $24 billion a year gambling on the internet, a large portion of which is from the United States, from which you're getting no taxes, some taxes would be more than what you're getting now.
Well, Representative Scott, we hear this, or I've heard this argument in academic circles for years, and basically, I think you raised the issue that I tried to start out with, which is that this is an international issue. We need to get the State Department in on this and start talking about this in terms of international economics and our friendship, commerce, and navigation treaties, and that would alleviate this type of problem. I think we're saying the wrong.
Let me tell you, if you're going to have an international agreement and you're going to come to an agreement, I think we're going to be on the short end of that stick, because most of the other countries it's already legal. So if there's going to be a consensus, it's going to be to legalize and regulate.
Well, with respect to Representative Scott, I think that what we are really doing here, and I've provided several law review articles just as introductions with citations, I think we're destabilizing the world.
You would simplify the thing by making it illegal to gamble on the internet, would you not?
Well, it's been illegal to gamble on the internet for ages past.
Okay, but I mean that's how you would address it.
And we're saying yes, and I think that's how the National Commission said they would address it as well, as a complete prohibition.
Mr. Orr, of the people that you have prosecuted for gambling, have any of them been for involving horse racing?
I would have to get back to you on that, Congressman. I'm afraid I don't have the answer.
Okay, now you believe the present law, it's illegal to gamble on the internet on horse racing?
Yes, that's correct.
And one time, having read the bill before you talked to anybody, you concluded that it would not be illegal if the bill passed.
We certainly have concerns that the bill's language could be construed to permit that.
Okay. Mr. Van Landingham, do you know what the average size of a transaction for gambling?
I'm told that it's about $110.
$110.
Which is,
when you do drug money, you look for $10,000 transactions.
5,000 generally.
5,000, so they kind of stick out.
Yes.
Couple hundred.
$110.
Do you know what the credit card entry on PayPal would be if somebody paid for one of these bills through PayPal?
No, I'd have to get back to you as far as what I'm assuming you're requesting the merchant code through PayPal for the identification of the payee. Is that really what you're asking about?
Well, and that wouldn't help you because you wouldn't know what it was for. If it was for a casino, you wouldn't know whether that was legal, illegal, gambling on the internet, or whatever. You just know the payee.
which is one of the problems with this.
And if the payee were an attorney who's serving as an escrow agent in France,
Additionally, identification of the payee would not be sufficient enough to determine whether it was a valid or non-valid payment.
are you aware of procedures that can identify someone in terms of age and residence?
No, I'm not. Not based on the internet. Now, obviously, if you meet with them in person, you do have that information.
Mr. Goodlatte is not here. I had a question on how they can do an interstate, legalize and regulate intrastate. Anybody want to make a comment on that? Okay, I yield back.
Thank you, gentlemen. I will leave it up to Ms. Jackson Lee. You're next in line, or Mr. Cannon. Mr. Cannon, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me just say, as a matter of predatory comment, that I believe gambling is a pernicious advice, and that, Mr. Kent, I agree with you entirely. From everything I've seen, that the costs of gambling far outweigh any kind of benefits that a state or other or society could ever gain from gambling. I just can't understand lotteries. I just think that the craziest things that we do, it's a tax on people who can't do math, and those people tend to be poor anyway. So it's a horrible thing from my point of view. But as I was speaking about Utah and the problem that we have with having Utah law diluted, you were nodding. I take it you would agree that you would not want to see any carve-outs. That would be horse racing, whether this is a carve-out or we characterize it some other way, or lotteries online. We would like to see that not happen. I would think.
You're addressing your question to me, sir?
Yes, to Mr. Kent. Yes.
Yeah. From my limited reading of the bill and the way I read it and I understand it, I don't believe that it enables or overturns. I don't think it changes the status quo with
regard to horse racing.
With regard to horse racing.
And you pointed out that what we're doing here, we're writing a law review article or we're writing a brief for a court. And the problem is, and I think Mr. Goodlatte, at the end of my time, you may want to address this, but it seems to me that what we are doing with this bill is being absolutely unclear about what we're doing with horse racing. And that makes the argument for the horse racers when they go into court, and I believe that Mr. Orr has already said that's probably going to be the case. So this bill is going to affect the arguments in court at least, and I don't know how you can say that that we intend that this represents a policy against gambling, against horse racing, when in fact what we're doing is not dealing with horse racing. And now that Mr. Goodlatte's back, I'd appreciate it if you'd address that, but not right now, because I have another couple of questions. But that seems to be the core issue, and I've always resisted this bill only because of the narrow interest of the states. Utah is one of only 2 shining stars in the country that don't have any gambling, and that's always been my concern about this particular bill. Let me ask Mr. Orr. Dog racing interests have stated that Section 1084F will give horse racing an unfair advantage over other forms of racing. Convenience stores have stated that Section 1084F or D will allow states to take their lotteries online. Do you agree with those 2 statements? That is, that it's unfair, not that whether or not it would make horse racing legal, but that it would be unfair to dog racing.
We continue to oppose all forms of internet gambling. So I think I've made a general statement.
What about lotteries and convenience stores and their concerns in particular?
I would make the same statement.
Mr. Vlaningham, if I understand your testimony correctly, your concern with this bill is that courts will issue injunctions that would burden you with trying to determine the purpose of electronic funds transfers, and that's a concern, right?
Yes, it is. I mean, our transactions, check and ACH transactions, are uncoded. We would not only have to determine whether it was illegal or illegal, but where it occurred, and several other facets in determining whether it should be paid or not.
Right, and you talked a little bit about credit card transactions and the kind of coding they have, but ACH, clearinghouse transactions, those are much harder for you to track.
Yes, we don't collect that information on ACH transactions. ACH transactions generally contain the routing number, the account number, and the amount. Therefore, the payee is not known and it is not tracked. And as we identified earlier, identification of the payee is not enough to be able to determine if this is a valid transaction.
Do you see that there would be a tendency for people to move away from these relatively traceable transactions, even ACH transactions, are traceable to some degree. Do you see that there's a tendency to move away from those to less traceable transactions like e-commerce transactions or foreign banking transactions?
Yes, if it was a criminalized activity, I think they would. Currently, I think that checks and ACH are not a predominant method of payment for these types of transactions, but I think most of the transactions occur through the credit and debit card industries.
Right. And if you track those, or if you criminalize it, the ability for a person, even a very young person committed to gambling, by setting up a PayPal account or one of the other kinds of e-commerce transactions, and then maybe setting up a bank account offshore, that is not a very difficult thing to do for someone who has a compulsion.
That's correct, and I think that those involved in the gaming industry would make that information readily available for those individuals to be able to do that, so making it that much easier.
In the few moments I have left, let me just say that we had an earlier discussion, and I know you had to leave earlier, Mr. Goodlatte, but I am deeply concerned about the idea that this debate becomes the predicate for a legal argument which totally transcends what we may have in our hearts and minds here individually or as a body, and I think that issue is sort of enjoined again in my last question to Mr. Orr. Would you like to respond to that?
I very much would like to respond to that. As you know, this...
Jeff, if Mr. Goodlatte would suspend just a moment, we're up against the wall on this. This vote is imminent. So, Bob, if you could be terse, I would appreciate that.
Well, let me make one point very clear, and that is that no matter what the outcome of the dispute between the horse racing industry and the Justice Department of what another statute, not a part of this legislation, authorizes or doesn't authorize, no matter how that turns out, it would still be illegal for Utah residents to bet on horse racing. So Utah could still prosecute no matter what the outcome was of that dispute between those parties. But more to the broader question about this, we had this same legislation or with some modification before this committee 5 years ago, and if you make the perfect the enemy of the good, you can see exactly what happens. During those 5 years, offshore gambling that's sucking billions of dollars out of this country, including from Utah residents, has quadrupled.
Mr. Chairman, may I just make one comment in response? I appreciate that. We're looking at the issue of preemption, federal preemption of state law. I think we decided last cycle that it would preempt Utah law. We will look back at that again. I'd like to work with you on that.
We would very much like to work with you.
But how we solve the larger pernicious problem is vital in the context of how we keep actually those places where we actually reject gambling pure. Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. We have been joined by the distinguished gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Shabbat. Good to have you with us. And I'm going to recognize the distinguished gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee. But before I do, Ms. Jackson Lee, I want to say to Mr. Goodlatte, in your absence, now Mr. Scott and I don't want to beat this racehorse to death, but horse racing has attracted much attention in your absence. Ms. Jackson Lee.
And we welcome him back. A lot of issues have gotten a lot of attention. Let me just recognize the good faith, Mr. Goodlatte, of this legislation, but argue or at least make the provocative argument as to whether or not there are elements that we're not curing. For example, it comes to my attention, has come to my attention, that in Internet gambling industry and prohibition thereof may prevent, or the way the legislation is written, gaming operations from verifying, one, the age of potential customers, identifying problem gamblers, which I believe Mr. Ken is interested in, and preventing the use of fraudulent activities. Your bill may, in fact, be standing in the way. And let me, as I pose those thoughts for you, suggest that H.R. 4777 would require, as I understand, states that authorize Internet gambling within their borders to impose secure and effective customer ID and age verification systems to ensure compliance with age and residence requirements. But is it your understanding that such technology exists, technology that can reliably prevent minors from gambling on the Internet? And I would, if I can finish my line of questioning, I heard Mr. Vandenham, I didn't have a question before, talk about the complication dealing with money laundering or banking scenarios, which leads us from one pool of dirty water into another pool of dirty water. If you might comment on that aspect of it. And then let me just say that it has also come to my attention, again, with the United Kingdom and Australia. They regulate their internet gaming companies. For example, companies regulated in the United Kingdom reportedly must use special age verification software, record all bets, place caps on how much an individual can wager at a time, and be subject to routine audits for fraud or money laundering. Might be interesting, Mr. Goodlatte, that we didn't take that approach. Have you taken a look at these regulatory regimes and assessed their effectiveness in preventing underage use and abuse by problem gamblers and money launderers or of regulated gaming sites? I think we should look further to both of those nation states as to whether that has been an effective approach to take.
Well, thank you, Congresswoman. Those are very good questions. And to take the last one first, we have looked at what other countries have attempted to do. But the fact of the matter is, as we've all acknowledged here today, the way the Internet operates, it goes to the lowest common denominator. So the country that is going to regulate the least is the one where these sites are going to flock to. And I think you will find that an attempt to regulate in the United States, where we have 50 different states that each have different forms of regulations today, would be an impossibility. With regard to your first question, also very good. We require states that might like to do this to be able to both verify age so that minors don't gamble, and verify that the person betting is inside the state when they do that. Neither of those technologies exists that are effective today, and notwithstanding what is said about what's done in Britain, they cannot effectively verify the age of the people placing bets online. So if that occurs, and if that technology is there to satisfy other states and prosecutors that a state can contain it within their state, we don't stop. Recognizing states have the right to regulate gambling as they always have, we don't stop them here on the Internet, but they have to keep it contained within their state.
I guess I didn't hear why we couldn't go the route of Australia and the UK, United Kingdom. Forgive me, not New England, but the United Kingdom, which seems to have some semblance of working. And I don't think I've heard clearly why we can't go that route. I'm going to let Mr. Vallanham answer this question about how murky this gets for you, if you would, please, in terms of the assessment you have to make in the banking industry.
And to make sure that I answer your question correctly, would you please indicate what
difficulties does the bill pose for you as it's presently drafted? And I'm reminded of, as I said in an earlier hearing that we had this week on sex activities with children on the Internet. There was some kind of pay line that they had to deal with. But I'm asking specifically, how does it impact you negatively?
Well, first and foremost, our systems aren't set up and designed to be a payment monitoring system. So in order to do that, there would be a required major overhaul of both the check clearing system and the ACH system, and ultimately would increase the cost both to the banking industry and ultimately to the consumer in the long haul. Additionally, I think that the continued change in the way these sites would collect their payments would force us, it would be a moving target. We would continue to have to alter those systems even if we were in some way be able to make it work. So it would be continued overhead in the long haul. Additionally, it adds yet another layer of regulation in trying to assess these payments and determine whether they're valid or not valid, and should we block them or not. And it would divert attention away from things that are being successful, such as anti-money laundering and know your customer programs that ultimately help us keep the fight against terrorism, being successful.
Mr. Chairman, and I thank you very much. Let me just, if you would allow me to conclude very briefly, because I respect Mr. Goodlatte greatly. He knows that we've been dealing with now a series of events that included the former lobbyist, Mr. Abraham. But I want to make sure that as we are discussing anew, and I think it's important for you to state, are we free of the taint of the e-lottery debacle and writing in language or not writing in language, or supporting this legislation or not supporting this legislation because my particular company or client that I'm representing was not satisfied? Are we free of that now, so that we, whatever our position is on this bill, for or against it, that we don't have this taint? I understand he was arguing about protection of state lotteries. We may still have that as an issue, but help us know that we're free of that taint as this legislation is before us.
Mr. Chairman, if I might have leave to respond to the gentlelady.
And I hate to keep you on a short leash, Mr. Goodlatte, but I've just been advised that there is a second Judiciary Subcommittee hearing that will commence at 4 o'clock. So we have to wrap up, but proceed, Mr. Goodlatte.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you,
Mr. Chairman. Well, Ms. Jackson-Lee, first of all, thank you. You have been dedicated to working on this issue. You have been working with me on this issue, and I very much appreciate that. I will say that I think it is very important that members of Congress address the fact that this legislation was derailed several years ago because of misrepresentations about the legislation made by Mr. Abramoff and others. And I think it is very important that we address it now, and we address it as thoroughly and as responsibly as we can. That's the effort that we have made with this legislation. I think it is very good, and I think it goes a long way to addressing the problem, but we certainly are going to work with you and other members as we proceed forward to make sure that we are getting it right and make sure that this Congress is not pulled down by misrepresentations by lobbyists about the nature of the legislation.
I thank the gentleman. I yield back.
I thank the gentlelady. Now, Mr. Scott and I have one remaining question. Mr. Vallandigham, am I getting better, Mr. Vallandigham?
Getting better.
Is it your belief that Mr. Goodlatte's bill creates criminal penalties for banks and or financial institutions?
It's my understanding that it would create criminal penalties for anybody who facilitated those payments. So I would say yes.
Well, Mr. Goodlatte, I was thinking that the civil penalties were only directed at gambling businesses. Now, you want to address that, Mr. Goodlatte?
Yes, I would very much welcome the opportunity to address that and to assure the members of the banking industry that there are no criminal penalties that apply to banks. The fact of the matter is that this is directed at the gambling institutions, and the only authority that is provided to law enforcement with regard to any financial institution is the right to seek civil injunctive relief. And
How about civil penalties against banks or lending institutions?
Only under what is already in existence under laws related to failure to comply with injunctions that might be approved by a court after they are approached by a law enforcement agency that says that somebody is in violation of law and they want them enjoined from being able to use the bank.
When you return to West Virginia, will this cause you to sleep more soundly at night after having heard Mr. Goodlatte?
No, Chairman, it won't, because the bill doesn't define gambling business other than to say the business of betting and wagering. Other statutes that use similar term have been construed to include within its scope anyone that conducts a gambling business if that person performs any act, duty, or function which is necessary or helpful in operating the enterprise. This includes waitresses and other servers, even if they weren't paid. It included custodians, telephone clerks, and doormen. It also included the bookkeepers and secretaries. So clearly, a bank can be viewed as unnecessary or helpful to an Internet gambling enterprise. No bank acting prudently could ignore that risk.
Well, this will be for another day. I know Mr. Scott has a question, and 4 o'clock is imminent. So, Mr. Scott.
Well, let me just pose the question, and we can get the information in due course. I wanted more information on how a state could, if a state wanted to, if Nevada wanted to legalize gambling on the Internet, how would that work? And if you have information on that. And also, if you're aware of identification processes where a person over the Internet can be identified as the person who is over 21 and possibly where their residence happens to be.
Mr. Scott, thank you. That, as I indicated earlier, we don't believe that such technology exists today. So while the legislation would recognize the right of states to continue to regulate gambling, including gambling on the Internet, unless they can meet those two criteria of being able to identify where the person is placing the bet and whether or not they're a minor, they will not be able to proceed. If that technology is developed and the state of Nevada or some other state wanted to proceed to do that, they would then proceed to do that. And if some other state believed that they were not using technology that was adequate to that purpose, then they would seek the remedies under this legislation to establish that they should be enjoined from doing that.
I thank the gentleman. Now, Mr. Goodlatte, you were chomping at the bit. I didn't want to cut you off. Did you want to be heard one final minute in response to Mr. Vallandigham?
Only to assure him that the intention of this legislation is not to put banks in the situation that he described, and we're more than happy to work with his association to accomplish that goal. As the gentleman knows, another piece of legislation similar but operating somewhat differently in its effect passed the financial services industry and is headed to the floor of the Congress. We want to make sure that these two pieces of legislation are made harmonious and in the process are as friendly to the banking industry as we possibly can make them.
Yeah. This has been a productive hearing, and I thank the witnesses, and I thank those in the audience who have very patiently endured the time with us. We thank you for your testimony, gentlemen, and in order to ensure a full record and adequate consideration of this important issue, the record will be left open for additional submissions for 7 days. Also, any written questions that a member wants to submit to the witnesses should be submitted within that same 7-day period. This concludes the legislative hearing on H.R. 4777, the Internet Gambling Prohibition Act of 2006. We thank you for your cooperation and attendance, and the subcommittee stands adjourned.